Hello, friends, and welcome to the May 19th edition of Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly podcast designed to help mainstream Texans of faith understand the legislative process and help you engage with the Texas Legislature. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Director of Public Witness, and this week we're recording with just over 1 week remaining in the legislative session, with several key priorities still to be decided. Texans of faith have done some incredible work during the session, and after a short post-session break, Texas Impact will be there to help you and your community engage in some tough but necessary conversations in advance of the 2024 elections. Immigration and border issues have really come to the forefront in the last few weeks, thanks to the news around the COVID-era Title 42 policy ending and some frankly shocking border militarization bills in the Texas Legislature. Those issues are still very live as the session draws to a close, and presumably will continue to be at the federal level. It's a good bet that border and immigration issues will continue to be hot heading into election season, and it will be really important for people of faith to be able to understand and educate others about what's really going on. So here to help us make sense of what's happening is Bobby Watson, Texas Impact's Human Rights Fellow, fresh off a trip to the border with the Texas Impact team. If you want to find out how you can get involved on this topic or others, go to texasimpact.org, to the Action Center, and sign up to get involved, and check out Texas Impact's Courts and Ports program to experience migration policy for yourself. But for now, I hope you enjoyed this week's conversation with Bobby Watson. Joining us for today's conversation is Texas Impact's Bobby Watson, who is serving this year as our Human Rights Fellow and has been very busy in the Texas Legislature and also with a recent trip to the border. Bobby, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Scott.
There's a week left in your first legislative session. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling pretty worn out. I learned a lot, saw a lot. I was glad to be part of the process, but it definitely is a lot.
It is definitely a lot, and especially here in the last couple of weeks, as there have been a lot of changes and a lot of activity on one of the issues that you're working on. And we have been focused on the Texas Legislature, but there's been some federal news that has been impacting everything that's going on here, both in the Texas Legislature and at the border. And that's the news related to Title 42. So this was a COVID-era policy. I wonder if you can remind listeners what Title 42 is and how that COVID-era policy has impacted immigration.
Yeah, for sure. So Title 42 is it's actually a health code that was implemented during the Trump administration in the COVID-19 pandemic that was used to turn away migrants and asylum seekers at the border without going through processes for fear. The reasoning is for fear of spreading communicable diseases in the U.S. And so that kind of has dominated immigration policy for these past few years and has been a major component of U.S. immigration policy that's prevented people from migrating over. And so that just ended last week and has led to new policies being enacted and a lot of confusion over the immigration situation, both in terms of how migrational patterns are going to be and also what policy is actually being in place right now.
I know there was a lot of talk leading up to Title 42 ending, which you mentioned did happen last week. What happened when that policy ended?
So, there was a lot of talk going up about fear of chaos. I think Biden even himself said there is going to be a lot of chaos at the border. News media, a lot of news outlets were talking about that. And there's at the Capitol here in Texas, a lot of people were concerned about that. And what we saw was not really that. I went down with a few other people, and what we were kind of expecting and what people thought was going to happen would be new surges of crossings, not at ports of entry. Of people trying to get in, which we have seen before in the past, and that didn't materialize. We saw a lot of confusion and a lot of people waiting around to see what these policies meant, but that type of chaos and mass surging really didn't materialize in the Rio Grande Valley area where we were or anywhere else from my understanding, from what I've heard.
Yeah, so I think when a lot of people envision like surges and chaos, they envision like thousands of people like trying to swim the river or overpower, border agents. What did it actually look like?
So I think what people, a lot of the way people talk about the border is like that, and even right now when things are more calm than expected, crossings are not that chaotic or that aggressive. Whenever we talk about crossings, what is actually happening is we see people who are crossing either through swimming the river or crossing other areas that aren't designated points of entry, and almost always then turning themselves into CBP. So it actually is a fairly orderly process of people just trying to get onto the U.S. to try and then claim asylum, which traditionally was a legal pathway, although that is no longer the case. As we've seen in the past few years, the asylum process has been really eroded and changed. But not everyone knows that, so that's how they've traditionally been seeking it. What we are really seeing here at the border is on the U.S. side, it is super quiet. We're not seeing high crossings. We're not seeing high processings. We visited with several of our community members like Team Brownsville and La Posada Providencia, which are both direct service orgs. Team Brownsville helps get migrants who have been processed to their next destination. And La Posada Providencia is a more long-term shelter. And neither of them have seen huge crossings. Team Brownsville, I think, had about 200 people processed through when we were there. And the week before, they had over 1,000. So they saw a huge decrease in crossing in people after Title 42 ended. And we also crossed several bridges. We went to the big Gateway International Bridge in Matamoros, between Matamoros and McAllen. We also crossed over between Matamoros and Brownsville. Then we also crossed over in McAllen and Reynosa and several other bridges and saw they're pretty slow. There's not long lines. People are going through fairly quickly. And like tourists are also just crossing over super easily, doing their shopping on the Mexican side and coming back over. That's what we saw in the American side and at the ports of entry. Well, on the Mexican side was a different story. We went over to Matamoros to visit with our friend Glady with Ayudandoras Triunfar, which is a direct service on the Mexican side. And there was huge tent encampments again. These weren't there a year ago when we last were there. They're very much similar to what they were in 2018, 2019 during the pandemic. It's these massive tent encampments with zero support. I think they finally, first time, just got water for the encampments. Besides that, they're living in these tents, which gives them very little support from any weather stuff. There was huge rain going on, so they were flooded. There was zero sewage stuff. They don't have access to healthcare. They have really just living in squalor. And they are people who were all trying to seek asylum in the U.S., but were afraid to cross because word had gotten out about some of these newest policies about the stricter punishments for crossing not through port of entry. And so it's all these people who have been there for months. We talked to several asylum seekers on that side who had traveled from countries like Venezuela or Colombia and who had been waiting for 50 to 40 days in these tent encampments. And they're all trying to get over using the CBP-1 app. And the theme from talking with everyone is that the app is super ineffective. It's hard to use. It doesn't work half the time. People also don't actually have good internet access or phones that can use the app. So it's a really convoluted and complicated system that is really not accessible for the vast majority of people there. And so it was a really big juxtaposition of what we saw on the Mexican side versus the U.S. side when we were down there.
Yeah, I want to talk for a second about some of those families in the camps because I haven't been down in a couple of years, but had a chance to go down several times during 2018 and 2019. And the thing that struck me about being in those camps and visiting with the families was hearing their stories and reminding both myself and listeners of this program and others why these families are making this dangerous trek to try to enter into the United States. So it was heartbreaking to hear from those families about the trek that they'd made, the reasons they were coming, and then showing up at the border and being confused about the processes for entry. So did you have a chance to talk to some of the families, and might you be able to remind our listeners why this is important?
Yeah, for sure. So we did speak to several migrants and asylum seekers on the other side and on the U.S. side too, who had already been processed. And we want to talk to them about the process and why they were traveling. And one thing before I talk about their actual journey and where they're going, I want to point out is they often knew the situation they were coming into. They often knew about how complicated the process is, and that they would be going through dangerous areas, and that even getting to Mexico they would be waiting in these hard situations. And they still choose to do that because it is better than the alternative that they are leaving. Most often, they are all fleeing a certain level of economic insecurity or political instability. And a lot of the times they're fleeing persecution from usually organized crime groups like cartels. And it's always a kind of mixed factor of those things. And so they embark on these perilous journeys because there is economic opportunity and safety in the U.S. And they are willing to try and push through these hard situations and wait these long times because it is still better than the alternative. And one thing I remember speaking to a couple guys about, me and Fabi were talking to these couple guys who traveled from Venezuela, and they were talking about their journey and what parts were hard and what weren't. And they had walked or the vast majority of the way. They had hiked here, and they talked about how they knew going through, and it was absolutely confirmed when they got there, that the scariest places to be was Mexico. And that Mexico, there was more extortion, there was more violence, there was more corruption in terms of the police force, less protections, and they still came and waited in Mexico in this hard situation because they still believe that it's a better alternative than waiting in where they were.
Yeah, I think that's important for folks to remember, and so we do, as people of faith, I think have a responsibility to try to figure out some solutions to this. And so many of the solutions I think would have to start at the federal level. What needs to happen? What would the ideal solution to this be?
So it's a complicated answer, but I think it's the best way to address that is to talk about some of the issues we see with policy right now. And one big thing that's been really concerning for a lot of us is, at least in the past 5 years, with both the previous administration and this current one, we've really seen the erosion of asylum in the U.S. And refugee status and asylum status, these are things that have usually been governed by international law, and then also the U.S. has usually conformed with. And then we've seen the asylum process restricted to be a really, really narrow definition. And that has made the process super complicated, super difficult, and very, very few people actually get through it. And so that particular aspect is, I think, really concerning because, like we said, people are going to try and get out of the situations that they're in because they're not good, they're not sustainable, they're looking for security. So they're going to try and attempt to get to the U.S. And instead of trying to make these pathways that are, effective and legal, we force people to either wait in these squalor positions or use other means and travel in other ways that don't fit our legal system. And all these people want to come over the legal way. They keep saying that, but the transparency of the process is terrible. So they don't understand how to do it, and even when they do understand the correct way to do it, it's so convoluted and difficult that very few of them are able to finish that process and actually come over. So I think dealing with that process and reestablishing and reaffirming the right to asylum in the U.S. is essential to our immigration process. And I think focusing on that aspect, on creating effective pathways versus the militarization, is what we really need to do for immigration policy. We see with these federal policies, Biden and President Biden before the end of Title 42 sent over more military troops to the border, which is already hyper-militarized. There's DPS is there from Texas. Texas National Guard is there at our border. CBP is already there. ICE is working over there. So we see all of these law enforcement agencies trying to do a sort of deterrence policy that doesn't work. We've seen this type of deterrence not be effective, and what it leads to instead is a presence of fear and over policing in these border communities. That when we talk to our allies on the U.S. side and community members, they said they were not appreciative. So I think that shifting that paradigm is the first step to creating more holistic, better immigration policy.
I assume this summer we will dig deeper into federal immigration policy and probably arrange some meetings if it's been like the last couple of years. But that said, we do have a week remaining in the Texas legislative session, and we're recording this on Thursday. You're in a break between Senate committee hearings that are talking about these issues. So can you talk some about the bills that are currently debated by the Texas legislature and the impact that they would have there on the ground?
For sure. So unfortunately, in the Texas legislature, all of the bills we have seen have really doubled down on militarization of the border and this type of strict enforcement. The big bill that everyone's talking about that around immigration is HB 7. And HB 7 has changed a lot. And even this morning, there was a Senate Border Security Committee hearing, and there was a committee a new version of the bill, and it is completely different than what it originally was. And what HB 7 essentially is, and the components everyone's been focusing on is, among a variety of other things, it creates a new police unit, a state police force called the Border Force. And it would be a group dedicated to enforcing state policies around immigration. And there's a lot of issues there. One is the constitutionality of that, and whether, ever since Arizona v. U.S., and I think it's 2010, the U.S. has explicit control and authority over immigration policies. States aren't supposed to be allowed to. So it's dealing with that issue. And then at the same time, it's just contributing to that over-policing and militarization of these border communities. And the limits of the border force is really concerning. There's not a lot of clarity over where they would be operating, of their kind of legal immunity, of who these people would be. At one point, they were going to let citizens be part of this task force, and now it seems it may not be citizens, but it may just be police or just people with former military experience, which is still potentially concerning, and that is the bill that everyone is most concerned about. One part of it that just got added on today that is concerning is they are trying. Part of the bill now makes it a state offense to enter illegally, which is again comes up into the issue of constitutionality of whether the Texas can enforce immigration policies. So that whole bill and everything that's been added to it, and even the different forms it's taken, has been the focus point of a lot of the anxiety and a lot of the conversation around immigration policy. And our take is that it is not a helpful bill that will, perpetuate this militarization and continue to harm border communities and not really address the root causes of our issues or immigration policy.
Yeah, you've mentioned the impact it would have on border communities, and I know every time we're down there, we're hearing folks talk about the harm that does. But I also want to call attention to something that you said, that there's still a lack of clarity about whether or not this unit could go statewide.
Yeah, so the bill's still in the process, the legislative process, so it keeps changing. At one point, they had one, I think. When this particular facet was a separate bill, its original language was that this force could operate in all of Texas. They'd have jurisdiction everywhere. But then it got changed to restrict it to just border counties and border adjacent counties. And now in this new version that literally came out this morning, I think it is back to statewide powers, although I'm not positive on that. But we're not sure if that part's going to stick or not, because it's, still in the process.
So we've been doing a Schoolhouse Rocks reminder session with our legislative engagement group members and others. Josh has a couple times this week talked about the the process for conference committee reports and all that. So everything that Bobby just said is as of like noon on Thursday, May 18th. And this bill will take many other shifts and turns and do all the things over the course of the next week. We'll have updates post-legislative session on where everything lands. But Bobby, anything that you can leave with our listeners today that you wish that they'd be doing in the weeks and months to come in regard to dealing with human migration?
Yeah, for sure. One thing that when we talk to our partners down the border communities that they talked about is the border communities really do need help in a lot of different ways. A lot of the people who are giving care to migrants or who are trying to be those first responders are faith community members, our churches, and they've been doing this work for a while, and there's starting to be some fatigue. They're starting to be either running out of resources or they don't have enough people, or they've been doing this straight for at least minimum the past 5 years. And so they talked about they definitely could use both volunteer support. They could use financial support. They could use donations. And what I would really encourage people to do is to develop relationships with churches in those areas, so that your faith community can really develop, so they can have that connection and see what it's like there. Because one of the biggest things everyone always talks about down is that by most media, by the Texas Legislature, by the federal government, is that border communities are not portrayed accurately, and that people keep creating these policies without understanding these communities or being there or seeing what it's like. So don't only volunteer, but come down and develop relationships and see what these areas are like so that you can better help them.
And spoiler, Texas Impact has a tool for you. The Courts and Ports program has been around for several years. Bobby, I know you mentioned Fabi during one of your answers. You want to give a pitch for Courts and Ports and the work she's doing?
Yeah, absolutely. In the Valley? So the other main staff member who works in immigration is Fabio Vera Benitez. She is our immigration advocacy and education manager. She lives down in the Valley. Fabi's great. She was down there with our team when we were working down there, and she has all the connections. So she also runs our Courts and Ports program. Our Courts and Ports program is a trip people can go experience the Valley on both the Mexican and U.S. side, to do some direct service and to really try and learn and understand the immigration processes, which are complicated and hard for even experts to understand what all these new policies mean. So it's trying to help people better understand and see what it is like down there, both from a human perspective and a policy perspective. So I encourage everyone to go on these trips, learn what it's like, and then to come back and help these communities.
Bobby Watson, I appreciate the time today. You have been doing incredible work throughout the legislative session, and so we all appreciate you. And I'm sorry, during the last 2 weeks of the legislature, you had to make special trips down to the Valley to deal with more issues.
Not a lot. It was good. It's good work.
Yeah, we appreciate you, and I'm sure we'll talk again post-session. Thanks for all you do.
Thanks so much, Scott.
I'd like to thank Bobby for the time, and thank you for tuning in. I especially want to thank you and all of the Texas Impact team members for your work throughout the legislative session. It has been an exhausting year so far, but I found hope in the passion and professionalism of Texans of Faith participating in the process. We'll take stock of where all of our priorities landed after the session concludes. But for now, know that we appreciate your work and recognize that the work will continue this summer and throughout the interim. Texas Impact will continue to be here to resource your civic engagement work, so go to texasimpact.org to sign up for one of our action teams or find other ways to get involved. As we wrap up, make sure that you are subscribed to the podcast and that you're sharing it with your friends and congregations, and consider joining Texas Impact to support this podcast and the work of Texas Impact year-round. If you have questions, let me know. You can reach me directly at scott@texasimpact.org. So with that, I think it's time to close out this episode, so remember, the world needs Texans of Faith active and engaged. So let's get to work.
Weekly Witness is hosted by Scott Atnet, engineered and produced by David Fasalo. Our executive producer is B. Moorhead. The opinions expressed on Weekly Witness are those of Texas Impact and our guests, and do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors. Weekly Witness is a product of Texas Impact, people of faith working for justice. Visit us online at texasimpact.org.